Good afternoon, folks. Thank you, sir. That was a first. Good afternoon. Hello, beautiful people. Thank you so much for being back on time. I appreciate that. I was telling President Katie earlier that if you are a fan of Friends, if you know the show Friends, dates me a little bit. I am Monica, and so if that means something to you, if you're laughing, it means something to you. So you understand why the sense of timing is so important to me. Thank you for being here. I'm grateful for each of you and grateful for our speaker who's going to be introduced in a moment. So just some housekeeping things. I just found out that the lunch for the retired ministers, which is tomorrow at 11, it says room 1. And that's in the parking lot. We're going to gather in the parking lot and no, it's not. It's a typo. It should be 150, room 150. So tomorrow at 11, for those of you who registered for the retired minister's lunch, it is in room 150 at 11 o'clock tomorrow, okay? Also, don't forget to check out not just our nonprofits who are on the second floor, just right outside these doors. If you continue down that hallway for where the resource tables are, you'll come across the 4 rooms that are for individual activities. And so if you happen to have 5 minutes and you are curious about what that's all about, go and check it out. I am especially interested in the 2 rooms, well, in all of them, but I am curious about the flourishing room and the see the writing on the wall room. And so if you get a moment, and you only can go to 2 of those, if I were to tell you which ones, I would say those 2, because I would love to hear what you have to say in those 2 topics. And so please take the time to take advantage of that space, which really is just for you to reflect. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask Dr. Dale Walker to come up and introduce our speaker. Thank you so much.
Our speaker is the Reverend Dr. Cody J. Sanders, who earned his Master's of Divinity at Brite in 2009. 6 years later, completed a Ph.D. in Pastoral Theology and Care, writing under the supervision of Jaretta L. Marshall. His 2 readers were Nancy Ramsey and Nam Soon King, and I've seen them around, so no pressure, Cody. At present, the Reverend Dr. Sanders serves as Associate Professor of Congregational and Community Care Leadership at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is written really big over my head in case you didn't see that. Prior to that, he served as pastor to Old Cambridge Baptist Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he was also American Baptist chaplain to Harvard University and advisor for LGBTQ+ affairs in the Office of Religious, Spiritual, and Ethical Life at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has published several books. There's Corpse Care, Ethics for Tending the Dead, Christianity, LGBTQ Suicide and the Souls of Queer Folk, A Brief Guide to Ministry with LGBTQIA Youth, and, as the slide was up a few minutes ago, his forthcoming book with Fortress Press is titled Spiritual Care First Aid, an all-hands approach for church and community, available April 15th. So, Cody, please.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you for having me here at Ministry Week. It's been years since I've been at Ministry Week, and it was always a really beautiful time when I was around here in Fort Worth. So I'm privileged to be here, not only at Ministry Week, but at a place I consider to be one of my intellectual homes, and a place I still feel very much at home when I come back to here at Brite Divinity School. The trauma of loneliness. This is a theme that I probably would not have considered all on my own, but in talking with the planners of Ministry Week, this was an area of focus that they desired some attention And it sent me into a process of exploration and putting together some ideas that I hadn't put together before. So in many ways, what you're getting now is an experiment in some thinking and some exploration and some research and some engagement that I've had both in my own congregational ministry and engagement that I've had with others in some qualitative research I'm going to share a bit with you about with congregational leaders. To get started, though, and I'm not as organized a professor as Dr. Snodgrass, so I don't have learning objectives. You'll learn what you learn, and it'll be fine. That's all I can promise. But I do want to start with what I'm talking about when we talk about the human. This is the framework I'm working with here in most of my research these days around the various kinds of things pastoral theologians think about related to the human being. I'm using a bio-psycho-spiritual, eco-techno-social framework. So if you've got that down, we'll move on and you'll understand everything else. The bio-psycho-social is a very common framework that psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists use for understanding human beings. Lately, the biopsychosocial spiritual has become a framework of use. Loma Linda University has a biopsychosocial spiritual research conference every year. But I think there's something really critically missing if when we talk about the human being and what it means to be human today, and it is different today than it was 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. When we talk about what it means to be the human today, if we do not include the technosphere, all of the ways that our lives are bound up with technology, that is creating a style of being human that is different today than it has been in the past, then we are missing something really critical. And pastors need to be really careful about how we understand the technological intersections with our congregants' lives. The other thing, and this is really on us, I think, as the Christian ministers, Christian churches, the Christian tradition, we have, and we'll get more into this in a bit, been so invested in theologies of human supremacy that we have forgotten we are bound up in the wider ecological web of life. Not over and above it, but bound up in it, sharing a common fate with the wider web of life, which is now in a very precarious place. So we are inspirited body-minds. Body and mind are not two separate dualistic things. We are body-minds. Dr. Snodgrass talked earlier today about how our gut sends signals to our brain and she didn't mention this, but how our gut microbiome is made up of as many non-human cells as it is human cells. That imbrication with the wider web of life, even in our own bodies. We are inspirited body-minds, alive within a technospheric network of sociocultural political communities, all the ways that we organize our lives together in community, inextricably bound within the wider web of life on earth through dimensions of space, time, and kinship. That's what I'm talking about when we talk about the human. And I want to hold together all of those pieces of our humanity as we move forward into this, because loneliness is not going to mean just one particular thing in this talk. It's going to mean several things, and I want you to keep in mind this complex framework for understanding the human being, the biopsychosocial, the biopsychospiritual, eco-techno-social. The other definitions I want to get to up front, and I really appreciate Dr. Snodgrass's lecture earlier today, because presuming you were here this morning, you now know much more about trauma than I would have ever been able to talk about in this lecture on the trauma of loneliness. So you have a really firm foundation to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. But I want to talk a little bit about what we're talking about when we talk about loneliness. And I want to be really careful to differentiate these three areas that we're going to discuss today: loneliness, isolation, and solitude. All different experiences. Loneliness is a subjective experience. It is how you feel. It's the missing of a feeling of closeness with other people. missing the feeling of trust with others, missing a feeling of affection that you long to share with others, a feeling that you lack the social connections that you need, maybe a feeling of being stranded, of being abandoned, of being cut off from people with whom you belong. This is what I mean by loneliness. A very important related concept is isolation, but that is a different experience. Isolation is objective. Loneliness is how we feel. Isolation is the objective reality of our lives, the physical state of being alone or out of touch with other people. And it is a risk factor for loneliness, but it's not the same as loneliness. I read in some of the research I was doing, someone who interviewed Nelson Mandela who said all the time he spent in prison, he was never lonely, even though he was in isolation much of that time. But there was a community there that had been built up over time. So you can be isolated without feeling lonely. You can also be lonely without being isolated. So isolation is the objective experience of being cut off from systems and structures that are supportive to our belonging with others. We're going to talk more about the systems and structures a bit later. Solitude is a different thing entirely. A chosen experience of peaceful aloneness. I, for one, love peaceful aloneness. Connection to the self. Space for contemplation. Healthy and necessary for reflection and restoration. Loneliness, subjective experience of not having the connections that we wish we had to others. Isolation, being objectively cut off from connection with others. Solitude, choosing aloneness to care for our own health, our own reflection, our own restoration, our own rejuvenation. Does that make sense as a framework? There's another framework I want to introduce that I've been working on for the last year or so that has really helped me a lot to understand what I'm talking about when I talk about belonging. And it's a framework I often start out with in my congregational and community care course, which every master's student at Luther Seminary has to take. And it's a framework for understanding our belonging that's a little more robust and rich and textured than what we often talk about. And it involves three interlocking spheres of belonging. One is the transcendence dimension. Second is the togetherness dimension. The third is the tethering dimension, all helpfully starting with T. Transcendence, togetherness, and tethering. Transcendence talks about our belonging to God, our sense of connection to the divine, our sense of connection to something that is beyond us, this draw outward from our bounded individual selves to something greater than us. And I think most in this room would call that something God, but people in other traditions and in other places might call that something else. We could experience the transcendent dimension of belonging to something of a cosmic otherness, the vastness of the universe to which we feel bound up in relationality and belonging. Or standing amid the vastness of a forest or something may evoke this transcendence dimension of belonging, that we belong to something that is greater than us and outside of us, that lures us into relationship. The togetherness dimension is about our belonging to one another. This is usually what we talk about when we talk about belonging. The ways that we are bound up together in communities, familial, church communities, etc. The tethering dimension is the one we've most neglected, even in our churches. That is our belongingness to the wider web of life. The ways that we are tethered or rooted in belonging to the earth. That our relationship to the earth matters to our sense of belonging, our sense of place, our sense of being in the world. So when I talk about loneliness and isolation today, I want us to think about the biopsycho-spiritual, eco-techno-social human beings that we have become in this three-dimensional sense of belongingness to God, to one another, and to the wider web of life. And you can see your sense of self landing somewhere right there in the middle of these overlapping dimensions. So the self, in my kind of pastoral theological view, is nested within these dimensions. The self is interconnected in all of these dimensions. Very importantly, the self is interdependent with these dimensions and is a process. Our sense of self is an ongoing process, not a static one. That's the framework, the theoretical framework. Are we on board with this? We'll have some Q&A times later, and you can ask questions or pose challenges. But for now, I wanted to walk through a few different types of loneliness that before preparing this lecture, I honestly probably would not have connected with the framework of trauma. But since preparing this lecture, I've seen some connections that have been pretty surprising and astounding to me. Maybe they will be to you, and hopefully they'll be helpful to you in some ways. The first aspect of loneliness I want to talk about, you're familiar with, because this came out in 2023. Vivek Murthy, the two-time Surgeon General of the U.S., issued in 2023 an advisory called Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. This is about an 80-page document that if you're a pastor and have not read, go home, look it up, download the PDF, and read this. It is an important advisory, likely the most important advisory for pastors that a Surgeon General has ever issued. Read this 80-page document. It is rich. It's a meta-analysis of probably hundreds of studies of loneliness over the course of time. One thing that he found is that the research demonstrates is that about 1 in 2 adults in the U.S. report experiencing loneliness. Remember, loneliness is the subjective experience of feeling you don't have enough connections that you want to have. 1 in 2 adults in the U.S. do not have the connections of affection and love and trust that they desire to have. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. Other countries, Japan, the UK, have appointed czars of loneliness to do something about the loneliness in those countries. Loneliness, this report demonstrates, is associated with greater risks of cardiovascular disease, dementia, stroke, depression, anxiety, and premature death. Worldwide, as many as 50% of people over the age of 60, 50% of people over the age of 60 are experiencing social isolation, the objective experience of being cut off from community with others. We can think about that in terms of institutionalization, growing old farther away from families than we have typically in the course of history. And the General Social Survey found that between 1985 and 2004, the number of people who have reported having no one with whom they could discuss important matters tripled from 1985 to 2004. So this is an issue that isn't just something that has been around a long time and we're just now thinking about it. This is an issue that is growing pretty exponentially in our lives in the world right now. So much so that the U.S. Surgeon General needed to issue an advisory about it and said in the advisory, and these are the words of the Surgeon General, "We will continue to splinter and divide until we can no longer stand as a community or a country." Have you seen this where you live? The health effects of loneliness compare to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So this is a social issue where we are fragmenting and dividing, and a biological issue where our bodies are bearing the effects of loneliness, such that our cardiovascular disease, our dementia, our depression, our anxiety, and even the point at which we die is being affected by our pervasive loneliness. So this is the general social context that I'm working with here. What this has to do with trauma, I wasn't sure at first. But I want to just give you a brief little additional word about trauma that builds on Dr. Snodgrass's lecture this morning, though that was a much more robust treatment. Trauma is a Greek word for wound. And one quote from Peter Levine that I really have appreciated over time. In differentiating trauma from all the other things that are adverse in our lives, Levine says all traumatic events are stressful, but not all stressful events are traumatic. And remember what Dr. Snodgrass said about how trauma is not the event that happens, but what happens to us, in our response to the event. So people can experience the same event. 3 of them go away with no real effects of trauma. 2 of them go away with the effects that grow into PTSD or something of that sort, even though they've experienced the same event that we might colloquially say is traumatic, but it wasn't traumatic to each of them. Gabor Mate, in his book, The Myth of Normal, it's a really accessible book dealing with trauma and a whole lot of other things, says trauma is an inner injury, a lasting rupture or split within the self due to difficult or hurtful events. And again, primarily what happens within someone, not the events themselves. He goes on to describe it as a fracturing of the self and one's relationship to the world. That is the essence of trauma, he says. Listen to this definition in contexts of loneliness and isolation. A fracturing of the self and one's relationship to the world is the essence of trauma. This is Van der Kolk. Trauma is when we are not seen and known. I never read the trauma literature through questions of loneliness to see the significance of how we often describe trauma as something about our relationship to the world around us and the people around us. And again, Mate, trauma leaves one diminished psychically or physically, more limited than before in a way that persists in our capacity to feel, think, trust, assert yourself, hold your pain, sorrow, or fear, or capacity to experience gratitude, beauty, and wonder. All of those things diminish with our experiences of trauma. Basic definition of trauma there, just to have that out in addition to what you learned this morning. Now, the trauma of loneliness. The trauma of loneliness, question mark. This is some research from some cognitive neuroscientists that I wanted to share with you who've been doing this research for decades on loneliness specifically, not framing it as trauma. I'm pulling together these 2 frameworks for us here to look at it carefully and critically through a different lens, perhaps, than we have before. These researchers say that sensations of loneliness evolved because they helped us to survive as a species. When our survival as a species depended on the group of people that we belonged to and being in close, trusting proximity and relationship to that community, loneliness was the signal that went off in our body minds that told us that we were not in close enough relationship to survive. So we needed to reconnect. Feelings of loneliness protected the person from the danger, the literal danger, being attacked by an animal or being lost in the wilderness, protected the individual from the danger of remaining isolated. And it told us that our protective bonds were endangered or deficient. So, this connects evolutionarily to our feelings, the ways that our emotions signal something to us. They are messages to us that we need to pay attention to. Connection, being in relationship with others, felt good because it was security. Being lonely or isolated felt bad because it was physically threatening. So the message of loneliness, when it emerges, historically for our ancestors 30, 40,000 years ago, and continuously today in our evolved body minds, is pay more attention to the social connections. Pay more attention to your social connections. Reach out to other people. Your bonds are eroding. You're in danger. This is what the feeling of loneliness is saying to our bodies. So we can begin to see the connection with trauma when we understand loneliness as an evolutionary gift to us, a signal to us that our bonds are at risk. So again, cognitive neuroscience on loneliness demonstrates these effects. The ability to self-regulate our emotions decreases when we are lonely, even at the cellular level, leaving us vulnerable to stressors and less able to soothe and heal. Being lonely disrupts things that our body depends on for soothing and healing, like our sleep patterns. This pervasive feeling of loneliness, they found, increased our hypervigilance for seeing social dangers everywhere around us. Hypervigilance is a major symptom of trauma. It distorts our social cognition. It harms our abilities to see other people's perspectives. Now are you beginning to see why the Surgeon General said that this is a danger to our social fabric? Because loneliness distorts our abilities, our cognitive abilities, to see other people's perspectives. It begins to shut off our empathic abilities to see where other people are coming from. And that's the loneliness piece of it. The isolation piece of it we'll get to in a little bit. And it makes us less satisfied and more distrustful of the social connections we do have. So even if we do have good social connections, relationships in our lives, the more loneliness increases in our day-to-day experience, the less meaningful even those connections we have will feel to us. So this is where I'm starting to stitch together these notions of what trauma can mean and 30 or so years of cognitive neuroscience research on the effects of loneliness to our body minds. Following so far? So, just visually, this is what I'm pointing to happening around our experiences of loneliness and isolation. Now, I learned a long time ago, actually when I was a Ph.D. student at Brite, I went to AAR for the first time, and I went to this breakfast or something where Katie Cannon, the great womanist theologian, was getting an award. And I don't remember anything else about that. I don't remember anything else I heard at that AAR, I don't think, except for one thing that Katie Cannon said when she was accepting this award. She said something like, telling people all the problems we face without giving them anything they can do in relation to those problems is a recipe for hopelessness. And I'm sure that I have been guilty of that in the pulpit in my ministry over time. Now, I'm not talking about giving easy answers to really big, complicated questions, because I don't have any easy answers to give you. But I do want to help resource you to do something in relation to these problems that we're lifting up. From trauma to hope, that's the theme, right? So I'm going to try to move into hope a bit. And I want to do that by sharing some narratives with you that I've collected, some historic and some that I've done through some interviewing with some pastors and ministry leaders. And one thing just came to mind, how I was talking about some of the research around loneliness and isolation with my congregational care class a year or so ago. And one student was just getting really into this notion of connection and community. And I remember she said something like, now I know church isn't supposed to be a community center, but ... And I thought, how did we get where we are, that people who have been raised in churches and are going to seminary to become ministers don't think churches are community centers? I mean, they're a particular type of community center, one with Christ at the center, but yes, churches are centers of community. Listen to this story that I learned, or that I heard through an interview. It's kind of a long story, and I'm going to read the whole thing because I think it's a really poignant example of someone doing something in relation to loneliness and isolation. The ministry began 3 years ago when the pastor I interviewed started it. And she said, I started getting people asking to meet from our community about kids who have gotten kicked out of youth groups or who were told that their church youth group wasn't welcoming to all. And they felt really betrayed. And their parents felt betrayed. Probably 5 or 6 people. I would be getting my hair done or having coffee, and someone walks up to me and says, hey, can I talk to you? She serves in a semi-rural area that is politically conservative with no other LGBTQ-affirming churches in the county, which is about 40 minutes away from any type of social services related to LGBTQ people. And even those services in her state are being rolled back. She said, we've tried youth groups before. They've been a lot of work and not super successful because we don't have the kind of funds and all the big hoopla that some of the larger congregations have. So she asked some of the youth, including her own teenagers, what kind of youth group would you want to go to? And the response she received was, we would want a place where everyone felt welcome. We want some place that's fun, where everyone can hang out, where it doesn't feel like there's always an agenda to change us or to teach us stuff. We're already stressed out enough. It's the teenagers saying this. They described desiring a group that was more, quote, more about caring for each other. Their church was just starting to make the shift toward LGBTQ inclusion around this time, and so the youth's desire aligned with this shift the whole congregation was beginning to make in its welcome, with persistent conversations that kept coming up in the community and a clear expression of what was at least the desire of a few of the youth. The pastor said, we had space, we had teenagers, that's what we started with. When they began meeting on a midweek evening, I don't think I told you the time frame. This is about 3 years ago that this started. They began meeting on a midweek evening. They started mostly with the pastor's kids and some of their friends who were coming to the group. For 4 or 5 months, it wasn't clear whether the group would work, she said. But soon other youth began coming from surrounding communities, some who were LGBTQ and some who were allies. They begin by playing games like Pictionary, trying to alternate between more extroverted games like TikTok challenges and more introverted activities like artistic activities. They rotate which youth gets to choose the music each week. At the holidays, they make gingerbread houses. They tell creative stories about what's happening in their gingerbread scene, and someone wins for the most creative story. She said, we thought all teenagers like lots of rah-rah, but they don't all like lots of rah-rah. It was about learning to balance fun games with activities that give them a chance to dial down and talk. And they have pizza every week. They eat and talk for about 20 minutes or so until everybody's arrived. Then they go around and check in with one another. After the check-ins, they begin whatever games or activities they're going to do together. One they've developed over time that has become a hit with the youth is a sort of talent show, but they don't call it a talent show because nobody wants to do a talent show. But they do, and some of them perform and others bring art that they've created. Some tell a story or talk about something that means a lot to them. One teen who insisted that she didn't have anything to share showed up one week with her viola and played for the whole group. And then everyone helps clean up at the end. They're careful in how they advertise the group because of the conservatism and LGBTQ negativity in their area of the country. Youth find their way to the group in a variety of methods, mostly word of mouth from youth who are already part of the group. But the pastor I interviewed said that she recalled once when a pastor from a neighboring town in a non-LGBTQ affirming church sent her a message saying, quote, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I have a kid in our church who is really struggling in our youth group, and it's not safe for them. Can I send them to you? So they started coming to the youth group. Some of the youth come with histories of self-harm and suicidality. Others embody neurodivergences like ADHD. She said, we just had to be like, okay, this is who's there. Many of them come to the group with defenses up, but after a period of months, we're developing friendships in the group. The pastor said it was really incredible to see because most of these kids would never have been friends in school together. Some of the youth who were more reserved at first are now taking leadership in the group. They're able to take responsibility for the space, she says. They take out the trash, they encourage each other, they talk to each other. They even talk to each other more at school, the pastor said. Several of them have said in recent days, this is where I come to be authentic. This is where I can unmask. The youth group has become such a place of belonging for the teenagers who come that many of them want to celebrate their birthdays with the group. So anytime a youth has a birthday, they celebrate it together that week. But that kind of trust takes time to build, she says. I don't think you can build that kind of trust with teenagers in that population, especially as a church, quickly. It just takes time to build. They need to trust that you'll be consistent and reliable and be who you say you are. She told me most of the youth aren't involved in the Sunday morning worship services of the church, though some of them attend other churches with their families on Sunday mornings. But the youth are integrated into many of the community events that the larger congregation does as a church. The town has an annual street fair, and the church is involved in it, and the youth are some of the ones who stand out and greet people at the fair, and they help to decorate the church for this fair. She said they don't come to Sunday morning stuff and do our Bible studies, but they do almost all of our community outreach with us. Of the youth group, the pastor commented, I would say it's the most dynamic thing we do now as a church. We started with 3 kids. Now we have 15 and others who have graduated. Over time, the pastor has learned that some parents don't allow their teenagers to come to the group because they think the church is pushing an ideology. The only ideology the pastor can identify, she says, is basically being kind to each other. That's pretty much it. Some of the most encouraging stories she shared about the group are stories of transformation she's witnessed in the group. One trans teenager with a long history of self-harm who became part of the group inspired other youth to join when the other youth witnessed the change they saw in his life and wanted to be a part of the group that he was a part of. This youth even asked if he could bring his mother to the group one evening so that she could experience it. So she came along and brought soda and a game. Of this particular youth, another teenager in the group said that one difference he notices in his friend is that the scars on their arms that used to be super red and bright and angry are all faded now. Offering advice to others who may sense a call to begin a group like this, the pastor says, quote, our goal was not to really bring people into the church as much as it was to have the group be safe and reduce mental health issues for kids. I think the biggest thing is not to have an agenda with them, or make sure you're very clear about your agenda because they will see through it. They're teenagers, and they are very adept at seeing through people's agenda. It's just so easy to undermine all the trust you build if you have another agenda. Secondly, she says, be flexible. A lot of kids have things like ADHD, so be ready. Just be ready for a lot of energy. Often we go in saying, we'll do this, and then we realize, nope, this is the time of day it is, their medication has worn off by now, this is the group we have, and just be ready to change and pivot based on the kids you have coming. Be willing to shift pretty quickly. She says it's just holding your plans loosely and making the youth the center of what you're doing. When it comes to working with queer and trans kids, she says, we found letting them lead the conversation about what's going on with the queer community is best because we're not members ourselves. We weren't trying to be experts. I think it's really important to help people have their own voices and start to step into that they have space to become who they are and to step into that and to have the agency and self-direction while providing some structure. So a lot of it is just really paying attention to the kids that you have. She reiterated, really, really listen. I think it's hard to do if you are not part of the community and you're not a teenager. You need to get them involved pretty quickly in directing things. Finally, she said, if we can do it, anyone can do it. I mean, we're coming from a conservative church background in a conservative community, and we're semi-rural. You can have a whiteboard and a marker and some Little Caesars pizza and somebody who can talk to people. That's what you need. If I were summing up the ingredients to the success of this ministry and helping the youth develop community that's life-sustaining, I define them in these ways from this interview. The ideology is one of kindness. The posture is one of listening to youth and giving them agency in the group's direction. The mantra that needs repeating is, it takes time to build trust. And the essential qualities that I identified throughout this interview were cultivating a community that is consistent, with adults that are consistent and reliable and congruent. that what you say you're going to do is just what you're going to do. There's no hidden agenda in that. And I think this is an incredible, inspiring story of someone who has done something in relation to our epidemic of loneliness and isolation in her semi-rural community. I'm going to talk through one more aspect of the kind of four aspects I want to cover, and then take a little break. Can you do another 15, 20 minutes before a break? I heard some iffiness over here. But generally, the consensus is yes. All right, so one more aspect. Organized loneliness. Hannah Arendt was a philosopher of totalitarianism. She studied the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany post-World War II. Her famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, laid out what she believed was behind the rise of the Nazi regime prior to World War II. And this is one little piece of this tome of a book. She said, what prepares men for totalitarian domination in the non-totalitarian world is the fact that loneliness, once a borderline experience usually suffered in certain marginal social conditions like old age, has become an everyday experience of the ever-growing masses of our century. This was Hannah Arendt in 1951. And then Vivek Murthy in 2023, we will continue to splinter and divide until we can no longer stand as a community or a country. And I don't think he was reading Arendt. He was reading the health of the nation. So let me just go through how I see some of this differently since some of this research that I've been engaged in for this lecture around what's taking place in our larger society. See if this is a framework that helps you make sense of something. If it's not, I want to hear about that later because it's an experiment. These are our three circles of relationality. And this is from a Brown University sociologist, Mark Dunkelman. He describes these three circles of our relationships as the family and close friends circle, that inner circle. This is the circle that's forged by blood and intimacy. The people we are related to and the people that we are intimate with, whether that's biological or chosen family and friends. So your family members, your closest friends in that inner circle. The outer circle is the tribe. These are people with shared affinities, political affiliation, religious ideology, national identity. These are people that we are not related to in any kind of personal relationship necessarily. They're the people in our broader sphere of relationship that share these kinds of affinities with us. That middle circle, he calls the village. These are relationships that are familiar but not intimate. So we are familiar with these people. They are the people who we are neighbors with in our subdivisions. They're people who live near us. They're people we encounter in third spaces like coffee shops and getting our hair cut and going to the grocery store. The people that we encounter on a almost daily basis. We're not inviting them over for dinner. We're not the godparents of their children, but we know them. We know who they are. This is the village. In the inner circle, we learn love from the people that we are related to by blood and intimacy, family, biological and chosen, our closest friends. We learn to love other people. From this outer circle, we learn loyalty. Loyalty to a political ideology or affiliation, loyalty to a religious tradition, loyalty to a national identity, loyalty to the things that we believe bind us together in relationship with other people out there that we don't necessarily know, but we share something with them. From the inner circle, we learn tolerance. Because these are the people who are, in various ways, different from us. They might not be in that outer circle of shared affiliation. They may be of a different political affiliation or religious group or whatever. So we interact with them on a daily basis and learn to hear other people who are different from us and explore what they think about life in the world. We learn to argue with people in person, face to face, about things that we disagree about. We show up at town council meetings and hash out what's going on, in town. This is that tolerance that we learn from being a part of a larger village outside of our blood and intimacy relations. Over the last couple of decades, the amount of time that Americans spend at home has dramatically increased, and the amount of time that Americans spend engaging individualizing technologies like television and internet has increased. And this especially is true with the rise of the smartphone around 2010. So the inner ring and the outer ring is strengthened by those trends. We spend more time at home, we spend more time around our loved ones. We spend more time on our phones. I live 1,000 miles away from all of my family members, and I know what they had for dinner last night because we have Snapchat. And I probably would not talk to them every day without that technology. Even if it was just the phone, I wouldn't call them every day. But we can just snap pictures to one another every day. So that inner relationship of love, it's not that smartphone technology and stuff is just wholesale good for it, but it strengthens it in some ways. I can keep in closer relationship with my family 1,000 miles away. The outer ring of loyalty, the shared affiliations, is strengthened by people spending more time at home and on their phones. The middle ring, however, is diminished by this individualizing technology. For example, Keith Hampton, Annenberg School of Communication at UPenn, just a couple decades ago, he did this research, found that Wi-Fi and phone users in public spaces were considerably less likely to participate in what he called serendipitous social exchanges of any type. He would sit with his graduate students in big public areas of New York, and they would make observations of what they were seeing people do. Nearly 80% of those he observed in public spaces in New York City were alone and ignored polite overtures from strangers. A high density of Wi-Fi and phone use thus appears to reduce sociability, he says. So what's happening in this picture, remember, bio, psycho, spiritual, eco, techno, social, how technology is shaping our humanity. What's happening is this middle ring is going away. And the middle ring of our village, the people that we engage in serendipitous social exchanges with in our daily lives, is diminishing. Because even when we're alone in line at the grocery store, we're on our phone. Even when we're in a public place with hundreds of people around us, we're on our phone. And the middle ring is, in his research, key to social cohesion. And it's the one that is most quickly breaking down right now. So are you beginning to see a little more what Hannah Arendt's observation of organized loneliness in Nazi Germany has to do with our new, different circumstance, but our circumstance of the diminishment of our village where we learn tolerance with the imbrication of our lives with individualizing technologies? Rosen again says, the appeal of online pseudo-communities is understandable. They require only limited commitment while still providing a sense of belonging, and participants can opt out and disappear at any time, something not always possible in real communities. Which has made me a little curious about how we understand people opting out of churches since the pandemic, when we had these individualizing technologies that were the only things that kept us connected, but also were much easier to opt out of. Which, this is just my musing about this, which I think made it a little more possible for people to opt out of the real communities of churches afterwards. Which, we'll get to this a bit later, means we need to be very carefully attentive to the micro practices of belonging in our congregations. How we immediately begin to help people move from guest who we are hospitable to someone who is at home at this place. And that doesn't happen by accident, and it doesn't happen by being nice to people. It happens because you're intentionally thinking about the micro practices that increase the sense of social connection and cohesion in that congregation, building the sense of belonging there. We'll get to that later, but just a further illustration of where we're going right now. When we come back, I'll tell you another story that's more hopeful. But I want to give you a good, I don't know, what do you think? 10 minutes? A good 10-minute break. Come back at 2:35, and we'll wrap up the last 40 or so minutes and have some Q&A. Great. See you in a few minutes. All right, stop your socializing. We need to talk about loneliness. I want to talk about another story here. As we come back together. That was 10 minutes, right? Oh, thank you. Okay, friends, I'm going to tell you another story that I think you might find heartening. And this is the story of, part of the story of the MCC, Metropolitan Community Church of San Francisco. And this is going to lead us into our third area of examination. We started with our epidemic of loneliness and isolation. We went to Hannah Arendt's notion of organized loneliness. We're moving into something else now. And this story is cobbled together from several sources. One is some written sources on MCC of San Francisco. This was a really significant church in, the gayest place on earth, in the Castro of San Francisco in the 80s and 90s. Some of it, though, is based on conversation I've had with the pastor there during that time in the 80s and 90s, Jim Matulski, who became a friend of mine when he was in Boston during part of the time I served in Cambridge. So let me just tell you the story. Starting in 1986, Jim, who's that guy right there in that picture, Jim spent 10 years as the pastor of the predominantly LGBTQ MCC church in the Castro of San Francisco. Throughout those years, his church became the de facto LGBTQ community center. Remember my students' notion that I know churches aren't supposed to be community centers, but in this era, the MCC Church of San Francisco became the de facto LGBTQ community center. The door is always open for services, community meetings, weddings, funerals. Jim said it was a protest every Friday night, which turned into a dance party. The church was growing and dying all at the same time. They added a second and a third service each Sunday, and they also held multiple funerals every single week. Jim told me he estimates he probably did 1,000 funerals in 10 years in a church that started with 50 people when he got there. About half of the city's 60,000 gay men had AIDS, and there was no effective treatment in those early years. Jim said they were dying and in great pain, and in some instances barely able to talk. Each and every person I talked to was convinced they had brought this on themselves. They were worried about going to hell. Many of them were experiencing rejection from friends, family, and loved ones, including gay friends. Many of these men became untouchable in their communities. Everyone from family members to medical professionals to funeral directors, afraid to touch a man with AIDS. So the MCC Church began instituting the laying on of hands at communion. And if you go to an MCC church today, you will probably still experience this. You take the elements of communion from one minister or lay person in the middle, then you go over to the side, and another person is there to lay hands on you and pray for you and bless you. So if you visit an MCC church and experience that, know that goes back to this time in the 80s when gay men were untouchable in their communities. The MCC church did this for that reason. So the MCC did the laying on of hands when the minister looked them directly in the eyes. This is how Jim described it to me when serving the elements of communion. And with non-intrusive touch, using their name when possible, offered them a blessing that emphasized unconditional love. Jim says it was an act of revolution as well as resistance, as everyone at the communion table, both the ministers and the parishioners, were excluded from the sacrament in most other churches. He said we were seizing communion back from our oppressors. He tells the story of one man he would visit in the hospital in his dying days who said, "Will you hold my hand and pray with me?" Which of course I did, Jim said. And he said that the only person who would hold his hand and pray with him was one of his nurses on the night shift who always prayed that he would be delivered of his sin of homosexuality before he died. Jim said, by the time anyone realized AIDS was a sexually transmitted disease, the damage was widespread. The disease could strike a fit, healthy young guy, and he'd be dead in months. Our moods became darker and hope dissipated, and I became kind of nihilistic. My capacity to sustain an interior sense of self-preservation waned. We felt like our world was dying, and this is impossible to communicate to people who weren't there. Although I think it might touch on something that some of us are beginning to wake up to. The only treatment for HIV available at the time required about 36 pills a day, and it wasn't very effective, and they made those who took them very ill. Marijuana was the only thing that helped with some of those painful side effects, suppressing the nausea so that they could eat and ease the pain a little. And where the city government had ignored the use of marijuana among the city's gay population dying of AIDS, the California Attorney General, who had aspirations to become the governor, closed all of the medical marijuana clubs almost overnight. They began cracking down on marijuana possession, seizing people's assets. Remember this when we get to the next slide. They began cracking down on marijuana possession, seizing people's assets. Jim was conflicted about whether the church should step into the situation to begin distributing marijuana to men dying of AIDS. He contacted Phyllis Nelson, a member of the church with a passion for justice, whose son Glenn and partner Rob had both died of AIDS. Phyllis said, "Of course we will pass out marijuana, and I'll stand right next to you." Jim said, "This was after my own HIV diagnosis. This was a change in me facing my own mortality, and it made me realize we're only here as long as we're here. What are you being so cautious about?" My ministry changed right after that. So in 1996, they began to give out pot to AIDS patients in the church right after communion before the closing hymn. We had rules, Jim said. We had rules. No money could be exchanged, the pot had to be donated, and people had to provide a note from their doctor that they had AIDS. We were promised by the supervisors and health department that the city would protect us as much as they could. There would be no city prosecution, and they would try to protect us from any state or federal prosecution, which they couldn't guarantee would happen. He said, "I took a risk, I used my body, I acted on a belief that was motivated by my desire to provide healing and comfort for my friends. And I didn't know what else to do that I could do, but this was something I could do, and I did it. And the risk was real, and the spiritual intensity was real, and the tangible relief for the people who used it was real." He said, "Let your acts of love guide you, even if it means great risk. The greater the love, the greater the risk, and you will never regret acts of great love." So going from organized loneliness to what abolitionist geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment, which is so well illustrated in that story. When the structures, as informal as they were, that were helping gay men who were suffering the really adverse side effects of the only medicine that was barely keeping them alive, were taken away, were criminalized. And Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes organized abandonment in this way. She says, "It is the dismantling of and divestment from private capitalist structures and public structures that communities depend on, such as schools, public healthcare systems, and a safe infrastructure in favor of heavy investments in law enforcement, which is deployed as the lone remedy for all problems that arise from the deficits that divestment creates." I won't read that whole thing again. It's so richly packed, though. You should take a picture of it and read it later. If I had given this lecture 2 months ago, I probably would have needed to really try to help you get what organized abandonment looks like, unless you come from a BIPOC community, really. But today, this is all I have to do. Real quick. Do you know the names Huey Newton and Bobby Seale? They were the founders of the Black Panthers in 1966. I got to hear Bobby Seale give a little lecture at Harvard a couple years ago. It was really amazing to be in the room with him. Their first program was the Free Breakfast for Children program. Did you know that? Good. When many poor black children couldn't learn in school because they were going on an empty stomach, their community organized. And in 1968, the Black Panthers set up at St. Augustine's Church in Oakland, California. And they partnered with the priest of that church and several parishioners of that church and a whole bunch of mothers in the neighborhood around that church in Oakland. And they partnered up to feed children for free before they went to school. By the end of the year, there were chapters in 23 cities feeding more than 20,000 children. When the National School Lunch Program administrator was called before the U.S. Senate and questioned about this matter, he admitted that the Black Panthers fed more poor school children than the state of California did. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, said that the Panthers were, quote, the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. Was it because they had too many guns, or they had planned to attack some critical infrastructure because they made threats to government officials? No. It was because the free breakfast program had become so successful that it was a threat to national security. And Hoover authorized the FBI's attempts to destroy the program by forging letters to stores to discourage them from donating food, and spread rumors that the food was poisoned, and raided the breakfast program sites where the children ate. This is organized abandonment. And it is also, very importantly, which 2 months ago I would need to explain to you, but now you know what I mean when I say this, the criminalization of care. I never thought teaching pastoral care was a radical thing, but at this point, it is a truly radical thing for communities to care for the people in their neighborhoods and in the wider world. And care, compassion, is being criminalized. Don't forget these stories. I'm not just telling you these stories because there might be something to emulate in them. I'm telling you these stories because these stories belong to us as people who are cultivating caring communities. The stories of the MCC Church in San Francisco, the story of this pastor's church in Ohio, the stories of the Black Panthers in St. Augustine's Church in Oakland. These are stories we need to survive in the coming days. But in the end, the state couldn't win the fight, so it subsumed the program with Congress's increase of funding to the National School Lunch Program so the poor children could eat for free in their schools. So if your state, like mine, Minnesota, is now a leader in feeding children for free, you have the Black Panthers to thank for that. They stood up to the FBI in order to engage in rebellious acts of care for one another. And that is what we must do. Finally, you may have seen the progression. We've gone from the personal to the more social to the political and organized abandonment, and now we're going to the planetary. This is E.O. Wilson, a Harvard biologist, who coined the term for our current age, the Eremocene, the age of loneliness, by which he means humans are becoming a lone species on a once lush planet full of life. At the top end of the estimates, there are roughly 1 million species of plants and animals that face extinction within the next decades as the result of human actions. The age of loneliness. Bio-psycho-spiritual, eco-techno-social. What happens to the wider web of life is happening to us. We are living and dying in an ecological collective, a web of life that is dying. The 2019 Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service, published by the UN's International Government Science Policy Platform, Biodiversity and Ecosystems Services, reports this 1 million species loss in the next decade, and disruptive experiences like climate change, ecological devastation, increases of large-scale natural disasters, combined with the politics of organized abandonment. See these connections here. Increase of natural disasters, politics of organized abandonment, leaving communities without the structures that are needed in order to be resilient in the face of those disasters. These things become traumatic when there is not enough adequate support structure to keep us together and healthy and whole and flourishing. Individualistic society has eroded collective frameworks for holding our grief, our uncertainty, our fear. And when you begin to notice the dissociation from what's happening, the ways that people don't want to deal with the Eremocene, or the pervasive inaction that you observe, recognize with a little compassion that these can be defense mechanisms. Dissociation and inaction can become defense mechanisms against the overwhelm of chronic collective trauma. It's so big, we don't know what to do. We will think about something else, be distracted away from it, fade into inaction as the web of life in which we are enfolded dies. On the other end, anger, aggression, and illogical reactivity can become attempts to restore the status quo. Does this sound familiar? I didn't write this post-January, this line about collective trauma. This is how we know collective trauma sometimes operates. Anger, aggression, and illogical reactivity can become attempts to restore the status quo. Another little term I'd like to introduce to you, if you don't know it, is this term solastalgia that Glenn Albrecht coined. The pain or distress caused by ongoing loss of solace and the sense of desolation connected to the present state of one's home and territory. A chronic condition tied to the gradual erosion of identity created by the sense of belonging to a particular loved place and a feeling of distress about its unwanted transformation. Solastalgia is the homesickness you have when you are still located within your home environment, but that environment is no longer the place you knew. Oftentimes when I am getting together with students who are just meeting each other for the first time, something like that, I'll ask them, instead of saying, who are you, where are you from, what degree are you in, I'll often ask them to tell a story about a particular aspect of the landscape that they call home. And the stories that unfold are so beautiful. And they begin to illustrate how connected we are to particular loved places, but we rarely ever talk about it or ask questions about it. Like, who cares what degree program you're in? What river do you belong to? What mountains are on the horizon that bespeak home to you? Ask people those kinds of questions when you get together to begin to build a sense that we are actually related to these aspects of our larger ecological web of life. And just very briefly and silently, I'll play this little, it's a tiny sliver of a type of ecological in memoriam. And because art is helpful too, I want to read you this poem. Come back, you gods of old earth, sun bear, moon bear, panda, polar, grizzly. Come back, you desert dwellers, bilby, pardaroo, nailtail, bandicoot. Come back, you majestic singers, Texas gray, Japanese, southern rocky, timberwolf. Come back, dear mates, dear jackal, wild dog, dingo. As loneliness descends and the spotlight grows larger, come back or take us with you, but leave us not alone without you forever. Come back. This is ecological philosopher Deborah Bird Rose, whose books I highly commend to you. Now I want to just talk a little bit about the ways that our religious and spiritual narratives have played into some of our sense of disconnection, our unrootedness from that tethering dimension of relationality and belonging to the larger web of life. I need to hurry through some of these things, but let me just note, all of the stories in the Bible that we read on Sunday mornings and preach in our churches without ever recognizing the way that the landscape speaks in those stories. The burning bush being one example from Exodus 2. Or, most famously, I think probably Psalm 19. The heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament proclaims God's handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. That's the first picture of a black hole. And a further illustration of our impoverishment of story in our religious tradition is the way that we read this story in our churches. Iterated in the Gospels, the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. The voice of God comes over them all. This is my son, my beloved, with whom I'm well pleased. And then the Spirit of God descends incarnate in the flesh of a dove. What Mark Wallace at Swarthmore calls the double incarnation. Jesus, the incarnation of God in human flesh, paired in that story with the incarnation of God in avian flesh, descending on the scene of baptism. How many of you have ever preached that story as a story of incarnation, God's incarnation in the wider web of life, not just in humanity? Religion, myth, and storytelling, Kim Samuel says, have offered people across cultures a roadmap for reconnection to the deeper patterns of the cosmos, reinforcing our belonging to community, to the place we live, and to the greater universe. When we tell sacred stories, we need to tell those stories in ways that we are not reinforcing human supremacy in our theologies, that we are humans only within a wider web of life. We are enfolded in that web, not standing over against it in the great chain of being. Really nice quote from the Pope here. Living species are part of a network which we will never fully explore or understand. Now, normally when I would do something around this theme, I would have you go outside and do an activity of multi-species relationality. But since It's a little cold for some of you here in Texas right now. It's -12 where I came from. We'll stay inside. But I would like to offer you this little exercise. You can just you can open this with your phone app, your photo app, and take this with you. You can do this with your congregations. It's just an exercise to engage you in relationship, not appreciation for, in relationship with the ecological world you're surrounded by and enfolded in. So take that with you and do with it what you wish. One more poem. Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger, must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen. It answers. I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again, saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. The multi-species relationality thing that you took a photo of is rooted in this poem. And it's a way that I've developed and used with my students and I've used with my congregations in the past to lean into what this poem is inviting us to do. Just one more connection to this and trauma. Ecological philosopher Glendinning, back in the, I think, 90s, talked about the term that she coined original trauma. And what she meant by original trauma was the rift between humans and the environment. And in that rift between the humans and the environment, we become exiled from our own humanity, resulting in numbing and a pervasive sense of not belonging. And finally, I just want to read this quote from Steffi Ben-Narek, who wrote a terrific book called a book called Climate Psychology and Change. She said, it is not cognition, but relationship, community, and a reconnection with safe belonging that brings healing. Collective forms of trauma-informed support are needed in order to increase psychological resilience. Relationship, embodiment, community, and belonging soothe nervous systems and promote reconnection with what has been othered or marginalized. So what we're aiming for in these practices of relationality in relation to our epidemic of loneliness and isolation, organized loneliness, organized abandonment, the Eremocene, our age of loneliness, is practices that do this to our relationship, to restore a sense of ourself, the wholeness of ourself in relationship to others, God, human others, and the more than human web of life in which we are enfolded. Now, a year or so ago, I asked a bunch of ministers on social media to tell me any practices that they have used in their congregations that have clearly influenced the belongingness of their congregation, that has had a discernible impact on people's belonging. And I thought, if all of this stuff about the Eremocene and organized abandonment was just, at least I could give you 10 practices that you could take home and do from 10 ministers who have tried them out and just said that they worked. And I want to lift up their voices because I've told my students these practices. Some of them are things that you've done, but I want you to hear from other ministers talk about things that they've done that worked really well. Added a deeper, more intentional weekly fellowship meal that includes people from other faith traditions. A member started a men's coffee group that has become a crucial place of connection for people inside and outside of the congregation. Every Thursday and Friday morning, we have middle school breakfast before we take them to school, and Thursday afternoons, we pick up our high schoolers to go get lunch. We put names in a hat and draw names to go out to eat with people that you may not know well. We have place at the table dinners where people invite each other over for dinner in an organized way, often by neighborhood. We renovated space, this is a Brite graduate, we renovated space right off our sanctuary so that people could gather before and after worship for meaningful conversation. And I've seen this happen in my own congregation. I never would have thought that space could be so important. But how you organize your space in a hospitable and relational way can make all the difference. At Oakhurst Baptist, this is where I was ordained, we practice sounding the call when one or several members voice a concern, a need, or a call before the whole church and ask others to come out of their seats and join them in acting on this nudge. It's a nice riff on the Baptist practice of walking the aisle during the invitation. Bob, who sent this to me, did this when marriage equality was becoming a possibility in Georgia and sounded the call for others to join him to work on that. Wednesday night dinner, we've been eating together for 20 years, no agenda, just sharing a meal. Interestingly, since the pandemic, we're getting more people and more commitment for dinner than we are on Sunday mornings. I led several sessions on my addiction and recovery as a way of addressing stigma in the church. As a result, several families who have struggled with this are more engaged in the community because they feel understood. In my almost 20 years at Trinity, what has had the biggest impact on belonging is shared work, mission, service, whatever language you put on it. Turning outward always seems to energize, to create a place and a role. Thinking of and doing for others gives purpose for being connected. Get out your phones, take a picture. These are just 6 books that I think you would really benefit from reading. The 2 over here are slightly more academic in their orientation. And then these 4 are much more accessible. These 4 you could lead a congregational discussion on. And the book that I think every minister needs to read right now is Let This Radicalize You. It is an incredible book written for our time about 2 years ago. All right, we need to wrap up. Oh, that's another book I hope you'll get. These are micro practices of care. If you want to know how to teach your congregation how to engage in spiritual care with one another, so that you're not the only person engaged in spiritual care in your congregation, this is the book that you can just use to teach those skills. It's written for a lay audience. I think you'll find it really accessible. And I mean like how to engage in deep listening, how to ask helpful, beautiful questions that aren't leading and that don't just put your opinion out there in the form of a question. What to do when you encounter suicidality in your conversations, what to do when you encounter abuse and violence, all these sorts of things. So I really do hope this will be helpful to your congregations. Finally, I welcome emails. If you'd ever like to be in touch with me, this is my email address. And we have 6-7 minutes for questions or challenges, either one. So if you just maybe come to the microphone right here, I'd be glad to engage you in some conversation. This is my snowy academic home now. I took this picture a couple days ago. Questions or things you'd like to have a little conversation about in the next 5 minutes? And if others have some, just come on out and line up behind the microphone so we can just keep it moving.
Hi, my name is Kelsey Cobbs. I pastor a church in western Oklahoma. It is a smallish college town, and we are an O&A church, for the only one for 60 miles in any direction. And I am really curious about how to help adults learn how to make friendships. I've been putting some of your work in conversation with a book I read about friendship and how it's not actually easy to do, it turns out. And what would you say, like, friendships in adulthood and building those friendships has to do with our ability to get in the range where we can tolerate people with different opinions, and build relationships even if they're not like in our inner circle? Yeah,
gosh, that's a great question. And I don't know if I have any answers for you. I mean, the things that these other 10 ministers suggested, I think all those are things that you might give a try to and experiment with other things. I do think that is a really important question, though, because if we're getting most of our connection through social media. That can be really important, especially when one is feeling isolated and lonely. But typically, in that way, we are only engaging with people who, this is the way that algorithms now shape our humanity and human relationships. Only with people generally who agree with us or who really, really disagree with us and we want to argue with online or whatever. But neither of those are particularly helpful to increasing tolerance for other people and other notions and opinions. So I think that's a critically important question, and one that I hope more churches really lean into. I don't know, how many of your churches ever talk about how to help adults make friends? One. So Katie Hayes would be a resource. And her book is a resource because it's the how-to guide for how she's done it at Galileo. But I really struggled so much after hearing that student of mine say, I know churches are not supposed to be community centers, because, I think community should be at the center of what we think we're doing when we engage in Christian community and congregations. So maybe the rest of you might put on your agenda, and I used to do this with meetings because I got so tired of meetings all the time in the congregation, because we met about everything. I would put up front in the meeting a big question, something that had nothing to do with what we needed to get done in the meeting, but so that we had 10 or 12 minutes of imaginative space to think big about something. And a good question for just opening of a meeting about whatever you're meeting about would be to say, like, how did you all make friends with one another when you moved here, or when you graduated college, or when you showed up in this community? And how can we help other people make rich friendships in adulthood? And let people just riff on that question. Because the wisdom, I think, is there somewhere, but we need to actually have space to talk about it. And sometimes those movements will be resisted, even in our churches. I interviewed a pastor for some research I'm doing who pastors a rural congregation, very rural, small town that's on the verge of just dying. The school is about to close. There's no children in it. And she visits the nursing home every week, and she just visits everybody in the nursing home who wants her to visit them. And she has congregants who fuss at her for that. They say that she should only be visiting their church members. And they drive by the church to see if she's in the office rather than out in the community, because they want her to be in the office, not the community. And she has dinner. She will have a big just gratitude dinner for farmers in her area. And she's had to just struggle to help the church understand why that's important, because they don't get why they need to have the local farmers come and have a gratitude dinner for them. So you might struggle with this in your congregations when people don't understand the implications. And what I hope, at least, that this presentation has done is to help you understand the implications of loneliness and isolation on personal, political, and planetary scales, so that maybe you help your congregations understand those implications too. It's not just about having a fun little dinner. It's about building a social, cohesive community that can be resilient in the face of a natural disaster, or engaging in really life-saving practices of relationship with people who are on the verge of deaths of despair. So yeah, good question. None of that answered it, but thank you. Talk to Katie Hayes. Maybe one more, and then we need to break.
You touched on it in different ways. I'm Jack Myers. I'm retired. How do you use our church space for the community?
Oh, that's
Outside,
such good.
Just religion.
Yeah.
FAEP. Ballet,
Yeah.
violin, piano.
Yeah.
How do we use that?
How do we use church space for things other than just our religious community? That's a question I think a lot of people are dealing with right now. And I really, I think sometimes it's the most appropriate and helpful thing for a church to sell its building and do something different. But sometimes I worry that we do that too quickly before imagining ways that this building might actually be a vital resource for our community. not our congregation. We could go worship in the storefront or whatever, but for our community. So yeah, my church in Cambridge started, what they did was started leasing office space downstairs in the basement to nonprofits who could never have afforded space in Harvard Square, who were doing social justice work. And so much came out of that. Central and South American organizing around sanctuary was done at that church. The FBI raided the church several times, and there was an informant in the congregation. This is true. They started praying for their informant on Sunday morning because they knew there was one. They just didn't know who it was. And they did a FOIA request years later, and all of it was redacted out, and they said it was because they were protecting the identity of the informant. But in later years, we had a ballet theater that rented space that taught children ballet, and we had folks who met for various kinds of purposes. There was a church in Spartanburg, South Carolina, who realized there was a lack in LGBTQ youth space, and they had space to spare, so they donated part of their church for an LGBTQ youth center to come and be housed there. I mean, all sorts of ways that we can partner with people in our communities. And there are organizations that do this now. There's one in Minneapolis that my current church, where I'm serving as an interim pastor, is working with, called this, something flourishing. I'll get it to you later. But there are people who can consult with you to help you figure out how your space can be a gift to people beyond your congregation. Yeah, I mean, think about all of the ways that so many of our, especially kind of downtown areas, are becoming entirely owned by corporations. It's just banks and coffee shops as far as the eye can see. To have a community space like the MCC Church of San Francisco was in the 80s, that is a gift, but it takes imagination for the congregation to figure out what the needs are and how they can be a hospitable resource to their congregation. If there's one more question, come on up to the microphone while I just finish this thought. That's another one that's a really Partners for Sacred Spaces. That's not the one that I'm thinking of in Minneapolis, but that's a more national organization. It's a good one too. This has been really, really fun, and thinking about this has helped me to think about new avenues in my research. So thank you, Lisette, to all the folks at Brite for inviting me to think about this with you. I hope it's been helpful, and I really would invite your correspondence if I could be of help to you in any way in the future. Thanks so much, friends.
Next, we have the workshops. We have Jeremy Williams in this room, and then Katie Horde is going to be across in Brite Bass Center. And so just follow the herd of folks that are going to be heading in that direction for that workshop. And then Dr. Nancy Ramsey is upstairs in room 251. So go right, these stairs, down the hallway and to your left, and you'll find the room that you're looking for Dr. Nancy Ramsey for soul repair. If you have any questions about where your workshop is, if you missed it, please come and see me.